Arnold. I am from the University of St. Thomas in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Today we have Boston College, and before I give you some more details, let's just have you introduce yourselves, and then our judges will introduce themselves, and we'll move on from there.
Hello, I'm Steven.
My name's Megan. I'm Laura.
And I'm Andrew.
Okay, judges.
Hey, I'm Kyle Hoffpaulo from Entergy Corporation. We're headquartered here in New Orleans, and I'm from LSU, graduate, undergrad in accounting, and I have an MBA from Loyola, uptown in New Orleans.
Hi, I'm Zoe A. I'm from the Ethics and Compliance Initiative, and so I am in the DC area, but not all of us are.
I'm Svetlana Gavin, and I'm based in actually Waltham, next to Bentley. But I was excited to see Massachusetts or Boston.
Wonderful, wonderful. Welcome, everybody. We are giving these instructions to every group before we start, so we have a level playing field. In this part of the competition, you are taking on a fictitious business identity, and you're assigning a fictitious business identity to the judges. So you're going to start out by telling us exactly who you are in this scenario and exactly who we are, and we are going to stay in character. And you'll have about 25 minutes, give or take 5 minutes, to describe the legal, financial, and ethical dimensions of the problem, and you're going to be recommending a solution that passes muster on all 3 counts. Now, we're not going to be interrupting you while you're speaking. We'll save questions for the end. And when you're finished, we're going to ask you questions for about 20 minutes or so. We're going to stay in character while we are asking questions. So we will be asking questions from the standpoint of the role that you've assigned us. After the Q&A, we can all take a nice deep breath. We'll come out of character, and the judges will give you some feedback on your situational analysis, on your presentation, et cetera, et cetera. Now, of course, the ethical aspects of your analysis are the most important, and we want you to describe them in a very simple and practical way. Any references to religion, theology, et cetera, are considered a weakening element of your presentation. And also, just straight out reading your presentation is also considered a major weakness. And during this presentation, every one of you, I assume, is going to be taking on a role. So, with that in mind, do you have any questions before we start? Are you ready to go?
We are.
Okay, wonderful. Welcome to IBECC. We're glad to have you here, and please begin.
Great. Before we start, I just want to pass out a copy of the study we're going to be talking about. It has a little more statistical information if you're curious or want to know more.
So as Megan's passing this out, like we said, so we're from the Boston Consulting Group, and we are talking to our audience is
It's the Massachusetts Big Data Tech Convention. So it's going to be companies that are doing things similar to what Facebook's doing here, and we're going to give them a little advice on how to do it and do it ethically, legally, and well.
Yeah, so we're from the Boston Consulting Group, here to present a case study titled Facebook and the Experiment. Did you know you signed up? An ethical and financial analysis of Facebook's psychology experiment. So while our study focuses on Facebook and the experiment that Facebook did specifically, we hope that other companies similar to Facebook will be able to apply our findings when collecting data from users in the future. So in 2012, Facebook conducted a week-long experiment on 700,000 of its users. The format of the experiment involved manipulating the users' news feeds in order to increase either positive or negative content. And Facebook then followed the subsequent posts of these users to see if their patterns of posting changed in any way. The results of the experiment showed that the manipulation of the news feeds did in fact have an emotional impact on the users. Those who received increased negative content on their news feeds posted more negative comments themselves, and vice versa. Those who received more positive content on the news feeds posted more positive comments. The details of the experiment and its results became public in June of 2014, so about 2 years after the experiment was actually conducted, and public reaction was mostly negative, with many users and commentators criticizing the damaging effects that the experiment had on its users, as well as the precedents that such an experiment had. So all of you know that Facebook is an online social networking company that has successfully integrated itself into many people's lives. With a market cap of over $200 billion and more than 1 billion users, Facebook is a massive presence on the entire world. 80 to 90% of Facebook's revenue is generated from advertisements, while the other portion comes from payments. Facebook also owns Instagram, WhatsApp, Oculus VR, and Private Core. So if Facebook continues to conduct experiments of this nature, it increases the risk of damage to its business. One such risk is the loss of customers. The damage caused by the loss of customers is especially significant to a company like Facebook, which relies heavily on the network effects provided by high numbers of users. So the backlash directed towards Facebook after the experiment was made public in June 2014 caused Facebook stock to drop by 5 points. High-profile coverage of the experiment, as well as the declaration by many users to end access to Facebook, was definitely detrimental to Facebook's business and image. Being such a powerhouse, Facebook will probably be able to survive the negative impact of another such scandal as it survived the first scandal, but the damage that could arise from such incidents should not be taken lightly by Facebook's management. Similarly, Facebook could face litigation costs from customers that decide to take legal action against the company for performing such experiments. While in this particular example, Facebook took severe precautions to maintain legality, the vagueness of its actions, as well as a lack of precedence, could give victims the incentive to take legal action. We will be going more into depth about the legal issues that Facebook could run into, but one thing is clear: the cost of time as well as monetary costs are just not worth the trouble. So the impact of experiments on Facebook's business core may not seem hugely significant, but it is definitely too substantial to ignore.
So moving into the legal dimension of this issue, the clear legal issue surrounding this would be the lack of informed consent that a lot of users are claiming in this situation. So Facebook is defending that claim by saying, when you created a profile on our site, you agreed to our terms and conditions, you agreed to our data use policy, and that leads to informed consent for anything you want to do. So for example, Facebook's data use policy reads, we use the information we receive about you in connection with the services and features we provide to you and other users, like your friends, our partners, the advertisers that purchase ads on the site, the developers that build the games, applications, and website you use. For example, in addition to helping people see and find things that you do and share, we may use the information we receive about you for internal operations, including troubleshooting, data analysis, testing, research, and service improvement. Further, the site's legal terms read, we can analyze your application, content, and data for any purpose. So the published study that you guys have there is explicitly stating that the experiment was consistent with this data use policy, to which all users agreed prior to creating an account. So Facebook is saying, we have your informed consent, it's done as soon as you make your profile. However, most common research practices require a bit more explicit agreement when someone's agreed to be a subject of research. According to federal regulations, researchers must explain to the participants the purposes of the study, describe the procedures, and explain any foreseeable risks. Even more interestingly, the journal in which the study was published, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, mandates that all experiments have been conducted according to the principles expressed in the Declaration of Helsinki, which also dictates that subjects be informed of the aims, methods, and discomforts of the study. So there's been quite a bit of outcry against Facebook's lax definition of informed consent. Some researchers find it ridiculous that clicking a box on a website constitutes informed consent. And they think that merely agreeing to a blanket clause and this long terms of use statement is not meeting the standards that they advise. So there might be a bit of a culture gap there between psychological researchers and tech companies that are doing that psychology research now. So one opinion is that users should have minimally been able to opt out of the study, which was definitely not an option in this case. Now, for circumstances where informed consent is unreasonable due to the nature of the study, there's an option to debrief participants after the study has already been completed. So in what is called deceptive research, the real purpose of the research can't be revealed to the participants because it might delegitimize the results. So an argument can be made that Facebook's study falls into this category. An awareness of the manipulation might have affected the user's response to it. However, it is expected that subjects be provided with the pertinent information at the time when it's appropriate. In other words, they should have been debriefed. And nowhere in the study does it state that Facebook allowed users to know that they were part of this study, even after it had already been completed. A debriefing did not occur here, and it easily could have. They have their emails, they have access to their notification centers. They're always in their faces. They should have debriefed. Now, keeping these issues in mind, there are a couple key factors that form the framework surrounding human subjects research that must be addressed in analyzing this legal dimension. The first involves determining whether the research even meets the federal definition of what is human subjects research. So research is a systematic investigation including research, development, testing, and evaluation designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. This definitely meets the definition of research. That's not the issue here. The issue is when we define human subject, there's a requirement that the investigator gets the data through what is known as intervention. So here, intervention is defined as manipulations of the subject or the subject's environment that are performed for research purposes. So one could argue that how Facebook normally filters your newsfeed, there's an algorithm they don't tell anyone about, is manipulation, and that this study didn't deviate from that baseline of manipulation that's already involved in the website. However, one could also argue that manipulation done for the definite purpose of research is a deviation from that baseline. So if we were to assume that you take the latter opinion and you're defining this as human subjects research, there's a couple things that regulate such research. The first is the 1974 National Research Act, which was passed after ethical violations were revealed in the Tuskegee syphilis study. So the NRA is the main federal guideline for human subjects research. However, Facebook is in no way required to follow this law if it's internally funded and independently conducted research. So as per the language of the NRA, human subjects research is subject to review only when it is conducted or funded by any federal department or agency that is listed, and those are called common rule agencies. So human subjects research conducted and funded solely by entities like Facebook isn't subject to these regulations. One kink in this potential get-out-of-jail-free card for Facebook is that 2 of the study's 3 authors are affiliated with universities, Cornell and the University of California at San Francisco. So universities that accept research funds from common rule agencies must sign what is known as a federal-wide assurance, or an FWA. And that identifies the institutional review board that's going to review any funded research. So what an institutional review board is basically, because of the NRA, universities are required to have a board or to identify a board that's going to review the human subject research for any potential ethical violations. So universities may also choose through the FWA to voluntarily extend that requirement to all human subjects research done affiliated through the university, including by its faculty and students. So Cornell and presumably UCSF have agreed to this extension, making these faculty who authored the study required to undergo IRB review if they're engaged in the research. So that word engaged also throws a kink in the mix. To be engaged in the research, there's no definition for this in the federal regulation. There's no firm standard for what this means. But Health and Human Services has released what they're saying is an optional, non-binding guidance on the matter. So the general rule is that an institution is engaged in research when its employer or agent obtains data about subjects through intervention or interaction, identifiable private information about subjects, or subjects' informed consent. According to that published study, this was not the case. The research and data analysis was done solely by the Facebook employee, and thus the Cornell and the UCSF author were not involved in this. And that means that under IRB rules, they're eligible for what is known as a pre-existing data exemption. So because they didn't collect the data themselves, they don't actually have to go through the full review of an IRB. They can just show them what it is. Look, we already had the data. It's not a big deal. I can't identify anybody from this data, which is also a key component, that the data must be anonymous to that researcher. So the editor of the study has actually confirmed that that's what happened with the Cornell Institutional Review Board in this particular case, and that they let it go through without a review under that exemption. So under all of these facts that I presented, and it's a lot, you can see that Facebook was not subject to federal regulations nor the review of an IRB. And seeing as all 700,000 subjects are not currently benefiting from a class action lawsuit, there's clearly been no legal action taken in this case. And they probably wouldn't win even if they did. The experiment, in fact, was almost certainly legal. And despite the obvious issues with informed consent and lack of debriefing, the federal regulations covering human subject research don't even apply to Facebook. despite the institutional affiliations as well. So the legality of the research can hardly be called into question. The ethical component, however, is a different story.
Thank you, Megan. So taking right off for where Megan left off, it's important for us to look at the ethical considerations that Facebook must look into in order to make its decision and addressing this problem. And in order to do this, we decided to analyze the case based on the Langendorfer-Rockness ethics model. So what this ethics model is a 7-step process in which one is able to apply his or her own internal sense of right or wrong to a situation. So we find this to be very important because one is able to use their own internal ethical compass. Why this is important is because it allows people to avoid the pitfalls of looking at a situation, of being a solution, looking at like a single black or white solution, a single one objective answer. It erases all of that and instead allows people to base off their own broad sense of values, their broad sense of what is right and wrong in order to address the situation in such a way as they can address all the complexities of the issue at hand. So step 1 has us determine the facts of the situation, and in order to determine the facts of the situation, we're going to turn now to Lauren.
How does it feel when someone takes advantage of your good faith? I'm not talking about a bait and switch, where you see a car ad and you head to the showroom, only to find out that there's one car available at that price. I'm talking about something more stealthy. It's very underhanded, and you're an unsuspecting captive. This is what we're concerned about today in the case of Facebook. Facebook data can be used with stunning accuracy to predict your gender, social, political leanings, sexual orientation, and IQ. In 2010, Facebook even increased voter turnout in the election. As Stephen discussed, by filtering positive words on out of a user's newsfeed, positive word connotation decreased by 0.1% and negative connotations actually increased by 1/25%. This seems hardly significant. Unfortunately, in the case of Facebook, with such a broad scale, the small changes can be amplified very quickly. For step 2 of our model, we identify 4 key stakeholders. The first is Facebook. The firm's reputation was at risk, and we already talked about the legal and business consequences of the study. Secondly, the employees are also impacted by the reputation of the firm and may be uncomfortable with the ethical values of the company. Our third stakeholder is the user. Trust in a brand is what creates value and helps generate continued business. Lastly, the researchers are also impacted by the possibility of future research projects and the use of the platform. With its vast demographic and geographic scope, Facebook is the ideal playground for researchers. For step 3, we examine 2 relevant values. One large factor at play is research ethics. Was the experiment legal? Megan covered how the IRBs do not apply to Facebook's research. Given this, should it be allowable? We wanted to direct attention to why this case differs from other A/B testing. Modifications of search engine results in Google ad testing are often going unnoticed. So the unrest did not stem from the fact that Facebook was adjusting its newsfeed. Rather, the idea of impacting the emotions of the users was what was causing concern. 2 interesting thoughts. The first is, how good are Facebook posts at indicating the psychological state of a user? It's difficult to quantify emotion. Furthermore, users are not always broadcasting their true emotions on a status update. Second, if Facebook can gauge emotional state, does it have an obligation to increase user happiness? Should depressed users be targeted with happier messages? Classifying Facebook users as lab rats is a dramatic overstatement, but this study is a good opportunity to discuss the role of technology in our daily lives. The second relevant value is disclosure or transparency. Many Facebook users argued that they would have preferred to know the study was going on. Unfortunately, this would create bias, which defeats the purpose of the research. The word research was not in Facebook's terms of service until May of 2012. This is actually after the psychology study was conducted, which shows a clear violation of transparent ethical policy. The abuse feels intimate for the user who's interacting with their friends. What are the obligations of a company like Facebook that has the power to shape our collective reality?
Moving on now to the 4th step of the ethics model, we look at the options that Facebook has to address the issue. The first option that Facebook has is to simply get rid of all of the research endeavors that it currently partakes in. What this would do is it would allow Facebook to avoid any of the legal or ethical gray zones that it might fall into. The second option that Facebook has is to maintain the status quo. It would keep up the same research methods that it currently employs, and it would do so knowing that these methods allow to maintain a great profit in order to maintain a viable business strategy, and in doing so, Facebook figures that this was a one-time incident and that consumers would not be as upset about this, and the second time that this is a one-time thing and would not be likely to persist. The third option that Facebook has is to update its research methods so as to maintain this money-making branch while at the same time undergoing different actions in order to obtain research. So what step 5 does is to assess how consistent the options from step 4 are with the values from step 3. The first option of putting an end to the research isn't very aligned with those values of step 3, because what it does is it simply has Facebook flee from the issue rather than to address the problems at hand. While it's important for a company to employ research ethics and to make sure that they have disclosure in their information to users, having to maintain these requirements should not cause it to flee from the business altogether, which it appears to be the case if Facebook were to end its research endeavors in response to the user backlash. The second option does not appear to be much better and probably could be considered as worse, because Facebook would not be altering its research standards at all, instead of maintaining its core business, feeling confident that they would not face future repercussions. And what this would do is it would look at the issue solely from like a legal standpoint and something of a business standpoint. It would know that it's technically not illegal to maintain these practices and that it has had business success, but it would not consider ethical values whatsoever. So rather than to flee from the relevant values or to ignore them altogether, the third option recommends a balance between business decisions, legality, and ethical values. Updating research methods can responsibly ensure that ethical standards are being fully serviced, while more clearly defining and meeting legal measures and keeping relative consistency in the operations of the business. Finally, or next, the 6th-step examines the consequences of each of the options in order to ensure that the best option by the option value consistency is still the best option when you look at the consequences, because one of the shortcomings in option values consistency is that there are unforeseen consequences in a positive solution, and there might be unforeseen positive consequences in a solution that might be considered more negative based on the option's value considerations. So looking at the first option, Facebook, by ending its research endeavors, would have the positive consequence of providing more secure protection and private information for its users, but it faces the negative consequence of researchers no longer wanting to go to Facebook because they would not have the same amount of data as they would if they continued this operation to some extent. Looking at the second issue, which is maintaining its current research methods, Facebook runs the risk of alienating its users and compromising the ethical values of the company. Future issues might arise in the same way as the one at hand did, and this would lead to increased user distrust of the company. While initially it appears that this decision could be positive in terms of research, as researchers would maintain this wide range of data, this might not be the case, because once users see that Facebook is not being protective of its information, they might distrust the company to the extent that they take their service away from Facebook, leaving Facebook with less options for data for researchers to use. Option 3, which calls for the update of current research methods, may slightly decrease the attractiveness to researchers who seek an unbounded wealth of data, and it might also cause some short-term problems in terms of business efficiency, with increased costs to implement these new research methods, updated research methods. But this option, as stated before, does successfully balance the business decisions with issues of legality and ethics. It provides a better experience for users by ensuring that ethical research is conducted and proper disclosure is provided, and therefore it diminishes the risk of future problems. At the same time, Facebook will maintain its robust platform for research and innovation, maintaining its powerful business reputation while enhancing its ethical standing. These 6 steps lead us to the 7th and final step, which is the solution.
Our recommendation approach is 3-pronged. The first is a better notification system. We demand this, and we ask that the changes and terms be bolded and easily accessible to all users. One option would be for an email to all users when the changes are made. Second, terms and conditions need to be transparent and thorough. Research must be covered and outlined in a clear manner. Lastly, stricter research guidelines are necessary. Research purposes, procedures, and foreseeable risks must all be considered. We also recommend a few things for the industry as a whole. One of Facebook's core values is to be open. According to their investor relations, quote, Facebook believes a more open world is a better world because people with more information can make better decisions and have a greater impact. The law is behind on regulating emerging industries, and it's even more delayed on regulating the research that fuels growth for these industries. We don't want consumers to ever feel taken advantage of by a corporation. This does significant harm and should be avoided at all costs.
So in conclusion, our recommendation for more transparent roles and research methods arises from the prevalent problem of social media networks that do not typically fit regulation codes. We believe that companies that follow business, legal, and ethical guidelines will best maintain and grow user bases. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's start the judges' challenge piece. I'll start with a question. What you're talking about here fits in with one of the major issues that's happening in the world, which is the whole idea of big data. And I'm sure in your research you've done a lot of reading about that. Tell us a little bit about the international piece. Now that you've talked about the NRA and all very important stuff that happened in the 70s about research that was all about this country. What would you say about what needs to happen in the rest of the world? Because Facebook is truly a global organization, and every continent, every country basically has different feelings about this very big issue. What would your recommendation be to those of us who are from different countries?
I mean, it's hard. It's hard to get countries to agree on everything. If you're looking at what they're trying to do with transparency right now in general, it's just not happening, and it's hard to see that happening in this field even as well. So I think the safest thing to do here is to follow the guidelines as best as you know how. That the possibility of an international guideline is so slim that something that coherent probably is never going to exist. And that's tough for companies who are operating multinationally or globally. But it's something you do have to look at individually. And if you can find experts in each country, I think that would be highly recommended, but it's tough.
In addition, we were sort of more focusing on the ethical issues rather than sort of the legal issues. So since that's the case, we think that it's a lot of the pressure is on the companies, the individual companies, rather than the countries to actually make changes and actually set up the guidelines and follow these guidelines. So we think that it's important for different the individual companies to actually take charge.
Okay, judges?
Good question.
I'm still thinking.
I'm still thinking as well. Are there any, did you do any analysis of any costs, actually monetary costs to implementing the recommendations that you've come up with?
I don't know if we have exact numbers for that. There would be probably significant monetary costs, especially if they looked into doing something like an internal review board, which a lot of companies are doing now, kind of their own version of an IRB, since they don't have the university type setting.
Right.
So obviously that would mean more personnel, more time, things of that nature. But when you look at if it's worth it, we think so.
Thank you.
So I think you mentioned something about the folding things on terms and conditions or for the notification system. How do you think that would actually feasibly have any impact on things? Because things are bolded on terms and conditions. If you click through, you're scrolling, there are some things that are bolded and that we try to make clear are more important. Does that have a big enough impact?
That's a very good question. I think that it's hard with terms and conditions, especially Facebook's, because it's split up into almost 10 pieces. And if you wanted to go through and actually read all of them, it's going to take you a very long time. So if there's some way for them to send just a short blurb about what exactly has been changed, instead of just sending that the terms and conditions as a whole have been changed. Because if you're trying to piece through and find out exactly what had been changed, it would be almost impossible.
I guess one thing I'm kind of curious about is legally, is this going to put our company in a weird place if we say we are going to send you an email that we've made these changes and these are the bold ones that are really important because we're assuming you didn't read the rest of them? Does that have any kind of legal implications for the rest of our terms and conditions of our services?
Basically, we just want the terms and conditions to be easier to read, to be more transparent. That was basically our main focus, because right now, terms and conditions, it's just pages and pages of small writing that users just sort of ignore. So we sort of wanted to find a way to maybe make the important things definitely more clear for users so that they can actually see what's being changed.
And as far as making sure that the rest of it is clear, that it is binding and that you're agreeing to the entirety of it and not just what we point out to you, I think as long as that's specified somewhere, or you're saying I'm agreeing to the entirety of the terms and conditions, something of that nature where they either click the button or sign or whatever your individual company is doing, that might take care of the issue with making the rest of it uncertain in its binding power.
One of the biggest problems is that, like, currently when they were discussing research, of the 9,000 words in the terms and conditions, only 2 are research. So it's basically not even mentioned at all.
Are there any other companies that have gone through a similar situation that you may be aware of? I mean, I know Facebook blew up.
Right. We don't know of any, we did not come across any similar situations to that at Facebook, but definitely considering the big role that big data is playing in today's world, and knowing that there's so many companies that rely on this as one of the wings of their business, rely on doing this research online and combing through customer data in order to get some, as a viable part of their business, we can see it emerging as a potential issue for more companies besides Facebook in future years.
This is just such a new field. 90% of data was created in the past 2 years. I mean, all of this sort of data collection, all the connection between different users, and the fact that millions of people, billions of people are able to, the fact that a company is able to tap into the information from billions of people is just such a new thing. So, and that's why it's been sort of a problem, and that's why sort of the ethical issue even exists. It's because there's no precedence to sort of follow, no guidelines to actually follow at this point.
Some firms now are even releasing their own data on their own. Like Christian Roderick, who's the founder of OkCupid, runs his own website with all of his analytics and shows how he finds different things and goes through different patterns on the website. It's pretty fascinating. I'll check it out.
Oh, no, that's just the end of the presentation. Keep going, judges.
Oh.
What could Facebook do to become a worldwide leader on this particular issue? Rather than taking, let's protect ourselves as Facebook, we've got so much money. We've got Zuckerberg, who's famous. What could Facebook do to just go way beyond this and take up the leadership position in the world that they need, that they can do?
One thing that we think is possible for Facebook to do, and they would be probably the first to do it, especially now, is to have the terms and conditions that are actually clear, more concise. Because lots of companies throw terms and conditions that cover everything that they can possibly cover, and nobody reads the terms and conditions, which is part of the problem that you were addressing earlier. Like, if there's only something's bolded and something's not bolded, it kind of makes it seem like it's less valid. Those things that are not bolded in the terms and conditions, like they're less of an illegal issue, and everything in terms and conditions should be equally legally liable. So it seems like one thing that Facebook could do, which would be, I guess, on the forefront, would be to have terms and conditions, which is readable, because no other company has that.
I mean, well, the reason no other company has that is because all of those words have very precise meanings in the context of the law and legally. So I guess from your research, I don't know how much you looked into the legalese of this, but is there some level of, it's not just going to be using straight everyday language, because that has a lot of different interpretations. So do you have any research that you've found that has readable English that is not going to get companies into hot water when things have different legal definitions.
We haven't found any company that has been able to do that, which is one of the reasons if Facebook can manage it, they would be a huge leader in the industry to prompt everyone else to do that. And I think also outside of the terms and conditions, going back to the legal mess that I was talking about earlier, there's a way to do either informed consent or debriefing that would kind of clear this issue up a little bit. If it's the type of research where you can't have someone click yes on a box that specifically says, this is what we want to do, this is how we're going to do it, this is what could happen to you. Then you could tell them afterwards, this is what we did to you, this is what happened, this is how we did it. So something of that nature, even outside of the terms and conditions themselves, because like you said, those are a mess. You can't even read those. No one I know reads them. So if they could do something outside of that, that might be the way to do it.
Yeah, following up on what you say, there's a reason why it's called fine print.
Yeah.
So that you can't read it. And so for them to simply change the fine print, I can certainly see that from a legal argument that they want to keep themselves covered. But changing something that nobody reads anyway, I think maybe you're trying to keep the lawyers from making too much money on something like that. But is there, I'm still asking the question of you as the consultants, beyond changing terms and conditions and wording of things, is there anything else Facebook could do? What opportunity can they take that's positive? Let's call this issue, in this case, a wake-up call for Facebook and for everybody else as well. What could be done to change this, other than just changing the Facebook situation? This is huge. This is big data. This is the topic of the entire business world right now. What can Facebook do? Just think really big here and say, what can Facebook do to change the industry?
I think it'd be great to have a Silicon Valley review board. So
now we're getting to my question.
I want a big IRB that just goes through all of it, and I think that's something, if the cost was shared, might be a little more reasonable. Going back to your question of managing the costs of that, they can get more companies on board. Google probably needs to get on that, to be honest. Something of that nature might be very exciting to see in the industry.
Mm-hmm.
I think going off to have all their resources and their international reach, they could have some kind of a convention or like an international clearinghouse where everything kind of goes through and they talk about the ethics of it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Anything else? Questions answered for everybody? Great, thank you very much. Let's take a deep breath here. We will jump out of our roles as who you had and just be back to who we are as human beings, and let's give some feedback to the team on whatever you see, judges.
Well, the Silicon Valley Review Board, I would have led with that. If that's something that you're thinking about, especially since you're coming from the context of we're not Facebook, that you're not telling us to do anything, you're just telling us at a convention or was it a conference about like big new ideas. You know, that's big. That's something I think that you could really tell us your ideas about, and they don't have to be that concrete since we aren't Facebook, but definitely I think that's tremendously interesting, and that would be something to really expand upon.
I thought you had a very good choice of an ethical case. I thought this was, this is obviously, like he was saying, something that's sort of the forefront of what's going on. I thought you had a very good organization of the presentation, obviously very professional appearance and presentation style. I would like to see maybe if you could slow it down a little bit, just simply maybe me as the audience, but the speed with which the facts were coming at me was made it a little hard to follow at times. But I understand you were trying to get across quite a bit of information, and I think it'd become more comfortable with that. The more practice you get. I think you did a great job of thinking through the relevant issues. I like that you had a walkthrough of the various options and what the consequences were. So sort of like a cost-benefit analysis kind of thing. And didn't just jump to a solution necessarily. And your recommended solution I thought was clear and concise. And I like that you had a conclusion, also very good. And you all did a good job of handing off between each other. So good job overall.
Yeah, I liked your presentation as well. Just following up on what Zoe was talking, you could maybe my questions could have been a little clearer, but that's what I was pushing you to see is what can we do to take this beyond repair and take it on to leadership? And you got right where you needed to go with the whole Silicon Valley thing. There have been companies that have gotten in trouble like this, and they say, okay, let's see how we can lead our way out of this particular situation, and they can change the world. There's some Burns Convention. This happened many, many years ago, that they get different countries to subscribe to the Burns Convention, which is basically about copyright and intellectual property. And maybe as you were saying, it's impossible on an international level to do something, but here in the U.S., you could not only start up something like the Silicon Valley, you could get companies to fund it and kick in money, and all of a sudden they can use that in their marketing. We're a member of the Silicon Valley Convention or whatever. So always look for the big item in something like this. Had you led with that, that would have been just incredible. I'm glad you got to it at Q&A. I think you're a very well-polished team. I think you represented Boston College very well, and that was enjoyable to listen to you.
I second that, and especially about Silicon Valley, it's actually funny that you mentioned that, because there are indeed some companies that right now are getting ready to talk about big data and how they handle that and all of the terms and conditions. And those companies are the Googles and the Apples, where if you start reading, it could take you several hours to read through that, and they've all gotten in trouble for certain facets. I mean, Apple recently, when they pushed an album, YouTube's album on everybody's device, which was obviously no one consented to that, and all of a sudden you have a new album. But it's certainly an issue that exists, and yes, Facebook got in trouble, and the case that you discussed was great and very thorough, and I really appreciate from the beginning till the end to the conclusion, giving us all the options and what could be the implementations of each option.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The judges will have some forms to fill out, and we'll deliberate a little bit here and there, so you get to enjoy your afternoon.